Hey guys, it's Rachel. I hope the quality of this video is okay for you. I haven't got my new webcam at the moment, so I'm using my computer one, so the quality might not be as good as it has been before. It's Thankful Thursday, and as always I'm here and this week we're looking at triggers, and we've been doing a rota, and last week we were looking at the unavoidable nature of triggers and where these different triggers may come from. We also discussed triggers with regards to things that could trigger anxiety, flashbacks, issues to do with post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety about going out, what things trigger depression, low mood. And this week we're actually looking, I guess, more specifically at eating disorders, because it's an eating disorder channel, but looking at why there is this need within the illness to seek out things that are triggering, and even when we're trying to not be around things that are triggering, what it is that kind of draws us into looking at triggering material, for example. So if you have an article and someone might put on it potentially triggering, why it is you cannot take that for what it is and move on, and instead you end up looking at the article, or a picture may say something like that. The internet is really, really vast, and there are a million different ways to read articles, watch television shows and see pictures, and some of those things may have warnings, other things may not. And what you may find yourself doing, which I think is an integral part of an eating disorder, is actually looking at not only just looking at the things that are triggering. So when you're ill, you may go through the magazines and find out the magazines which, for example, are about dieting, or about celebrity weight loss, or about, which have numbers in them. I haven't seen that, but I don't read a lot of those magazines, but I know when I was poorly I was looking at those things, and okay, I already had the illness, but it was a way of kind of feeding my illness. It was like, well, they weigh what I do and look how they do, and they're not in hospital, why should I need to be in hospital? When it comes to images and warnings about programs which could be potentially disturbing, that we still have sort of a pull to watch it. And one show I'm thinking about in particular is, I don't want to name it actually, but a lot of people probably know what I'm talking about, and this is where I have an issue with trying to deal with issues that are triggering, but at the same time you're publicising the programme or paper or the article or the book, and I find that really, really difficult. So I'm not going to say the show. What I will say is that from the feedback I've had, a lot of people watch that television show, and although they know that it is feeding their illness, they feel compelled to watch it. And so if you've got something like that show on television, and the easy answer is to say, well, don't watch it, what we have to understand is part of the illness, part of an eating disorder, is that compelling nature to watch that program, that feeding of your addiction, as it were, that you get something from it, that although you know it's going to make you feel bad or worse about yourself, it feeds into your illness. It makes you feel rubbish about yourself, and therefore are more destructive. It makes you think, right, this is okay what I'm doing, I'm going to keep doing this. It brings out a competitive side in you. And this is all the issue with materials, images, articles, television shows that could be potentially triggering for your eating disorder. Of course, there's other triggers. There are triggers such as you comparing yourself when you're walking down the street or you're out, you comparing what your intake is compared to, say, the people you're living with, whether that's family, friends, whoever. You comparing yourself weight-wise, food-wise, and the rest to when you were maybe, you believed you were more poorly, comparing yourself to when you were bigger and thinking, I'm much happier where I am now, even if that isn't the truth, by looking at those pictures, by feeding into the fact that you were disgusting, by thinking about the thoughts you had at that point about how much you hate yourself, and almost being in a degree of denial because you still feel uncomfortable in yourself and hate yourself now, but feeding into yourself that you were more disgusting when you were like that, that whilst you still might be disgusting how you are now, the more weight you lose, whatever, the less disgusting you're going to be. Triggers can't be avoided, and what I feel is positive is that this television show hopefully will be taken off the air. That isn't to say that that show shouldn't be allowed to be aired, but what people need to understand is that an eating disorder in many regards is an addiction, and you're going to feed your addiction, and it's no different than an alcohol addiction. And if you're putting something right in front of the person, you're expecting them to use a huge amount of willpower to say no to that. And whilst that might be possible through recovery, it isn't always going to be that easy early recovery or when you're poorly. So if you're trying to stabilise yourself and you find yourself watching these programs or doing things that you know are not particularly helping you, it's important to acknowledge that. And I also think it's important to own that and to see that as a behaviour, and one that to an extent you can control. But what I feel most strongly, and obviously this is based on my experience, is that as I move forward with my recovery, my obsessional behaviour, my compulsiveness, my addiction lessened, and so there wasn't such a pull to spend the time looking at these images. I mean, Gokwan did, he's doing his show on teenagers, and there was a girl featured on it who I wouldn't say, or the general consensus was that she wasn't particularly eating disordered per se, but she was spending like 6 hours a night looking at images of people who were incredibly thin. Now that was feeding into her, and to the point that she could barely see herself for what she was, and that she actually changed how she appeared using Photoshop before her pictures were ever shown on Facebook or wherever. And when you're talking about an obsession of that degree, and all it's doing is feeding your self-esteem to a point that there is no self-esteem, that needs to be looked at. And that, if you can see that as a behaviour, it can be something that can be worked through. So as hard as it might be to not buy a magazine, not watch a television show, you have to work with yourself on that, and you have to accept that those things are going to be there, and that there are lots of people, including myself, out there trying to raise awareness, activism and what have you, to reduce the huge bombardment of these things that come at us from all angles. And yes, social pressures have always been there in one way, shape or form, but what you've got to remember is that now, you know, we're in 2012, the internet is everywhere. If things get spread around, it's very hard to do things in private unless you have no involvement with the internet or with those means of communicating, social network sites, and everything is just it's just there constantly. You switch on the television, you switch your computer on, you walk down the street, it's absolutely everywhere. And so unless you literally hide yourself from the world, it's going to be very, very difficult to avoid those things. There are a few things that I can say with in terms of avoidance. If, for example, you are on somewhere like Facebook and you are finding it potentially very triggering, it might not be people with eating disorders, you may be vulnerable in your recovery and all your friends are talking about dieting, there is no reason to deactivate your account. You don't need to isolate yourself. I've said to people before, start a new account and just use that as with people who are supportive of you and who are in recovery and aren't talking about those things but are trying to build their lives back, and have that other account and kind of go into it as and when you feel able to. If people are part of forums, I know that you can have certain forums blocked from you, so you're only involved in the forums which is to do with distraction, so you're getting support but it's in a different way. If going to things like a support group is going to be potentially triggering for you, think about the ways and means in which you can gain support so that you're not having to deal with that trigger. And it's really about thinking about the different triggers and where they come from and what you're willing to do. So obviously there's going to be a degree of the illness in that you can't always help but watch that television program or keep reading that book or look at all these images on people's blogs, but you can try to protect yourself from some of that, and some of that might include only spending a certain amount of time online. So you get yourself hooked on watching all these millions of videos that are on YouTube, all to do with people's recovery or eating disorder, and there's all these images, is to say to yourself, right, I want to go onto YouTube to check X, Y and Z out, and I'm only going to spend 20 minutes. And I want to go on Facebook to catch up with a couple of friends, but I'm going to spend 20 minutes. and to limit your time with that, and then not isolate yourself in the times outside of that, but to find activities which positively help you. I know people are starting to use Pinterest. I don't know whether I've just pronounced that correctly, but that's a way of building up these positive things. But of course you've got to remember that you're going to be open to images that could potentially be triggering to you or damaging to you. Take all that away, take all the internet stuff away, maybe even the television stuff away. Books, most of them aren't that great, and the ones that I think you need to be reading maybe don't completely focus on, they can focus on eating disorder recovery, but are a more general approach to it. There's only a few books that I think can be read that obviously we're all different and we all want to feel understood, but to just be mindful of that and maybe take people's advice, people who are further into recovery, and sort of say, this is where I'm at, what would you advise? That's something that could really positively help you, is to ask for advice on that type of stuff. Therapists and such could maybe give you that advice. With regards to yourself and feeling triggered because you were thinner before or fatter before, or how you walk down the street, or feeling triggered because you tried on some old clothes and they didn't fit you, again you need to look at the behaviours of that. If one of your behaviours is trying on your clothes all the time, try and limit that. And it's no different to, we did a video on body checking, and it's about reducing your time of having involvement with these things. If it's things like you're going out and you feel triggered by the people that are around you, well, you're going to have to find a way of managing that, because there's always going to be people out there who are thinner than you, or have an eating disorder, or who are out there and have anorexia, bulimia, compulsive overeating disorder, and these things might trigger you. You might see somebody who's bigger than you and see them eating. I know that's like really sounds stupid, but I know a lot of people who say that thing. They'll say, I saw this person and like, I don't want to be that person who's eating that food in that way. I feel ashamed, I don't want to be doing that. And it's about trying to rationalise that behaviour and bring it back so that you can look at it as a behaviour. And what I will promise you is that as you move forward in your recovery, those things you will care less about. Now, when I was in recovery, and even a number of years ago, maybe even 4 or 5 years ago, I used to notice every, anorexic there was out there, every thin person would be going through my head. And now, I occasionally notice somebody, but that's only kind of when they're really there, and I just kind of feel sadness for them. But all of those things, you'll walk down the street and there'll be advertisements, or there'll be televisions and adverts that are telling you to do this, that and the other, and they do my head in some of the time, but half the time I don't even notice them because I'm not tuned into it. And that's the difference when you've got an eating disorder. You're tuned into everything around you, and it's about just bringing that back in, and rather than having it all out here, about just saying, right, I'm just going to focus on myself, I'm going to just think about myself. And that's like the best advice I can give you, is to just give yourself time where you can think about why it is you are feeling the need to use these behaviours, and to build up positive time with people, positive activities, and all the things that are going to help your recovery. So you can't always avoid everything, but maybe there's ways that can ease some of that for you. I hope that's been okay, guys, and I'll see you next week. Okay, bye.